Here's something you probably didn't learn in school. The end of the War of 1812 isn't just America flexing its muscles on the world stage. It is the completion of a 30-year-long revolution. It's a revolution in which ordinary Americans claimed a political voice and turned the country into something that Europe had never seen before. A nation built around a massive middle class. What's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. It's been a little bit since my last episode. Sorry to keep you folks waiting, but there has been a lot going on. I referenced this in a little interlude I did not too long ago. So yes, sorry to keep you waiting, but I hope you feel it was worth the wait. I've been kind of rejiggering what I'm going to do a little bit, and this episode represents the first instance of that. I'm going to shorten things down a little bit. I'm not going to focus on one kind of massive issue. I'm going to break things up into pieces. But over the course of the next however many episodes, I don't know if it's going to be a half dozen or a dozen, or I don't know, honestly, what it's going to be. I'm going to go through the period 1815 to 1845, roughly, and talk about the very important developments that took place in the United States at that time. And I think it's an overlooked period of history that really warrants examination. There is a tendency amongst Americans a lot of the time to go founding, revolution, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, the Revolutionary War, the United States is independent, then the Constitution, then the Washington administration, and Adams to a lesser extent, Jefferson's Empire of Liberty, and then something, Civil War. That really does a disservice to understanding how the Civil War came to be, what the relationship between the states and the national government turned into over that time, the remarkable jurisprudence that came out of the Supreme Court during the Marshall era and afterward, the economic and social and religious changes of the period that have a great impact to this day on what the United States is as a country. And that is not a period I wanted to give short shrift to. So I'm going to explore that pretty exhaustively, I think, and give you folks all an idea about what I've learned in diving into it a little bit more over the last few months. Again, I've taught this stuff for a long time, and a lot of what I'm going to go over with you I've known for some time, but I've definitely learned a lot in the course of doing this as well, and I can't wait to share it with you guys. I'm really excited. So let's go ahead and dive into it. As usual, I am going to let you guys know the resources I used. I'm still referencing Empire of Liberty. In fact, this episode is going to focus largely on Gordon S. Wood's Empire of Liberty. It's one of the books in the Oxford History of the United States series. It covers the period 1789 to 1815, and I've been using it in a lot of the most recent episodes that I've done. So I will definitely be using that heavily in this episode. But I am still using information that I've gotten from Give Me Liberty, the AP U.S. History textbook that I've mentioned a lot of the time, and it's used for college courses as well. It's a standard History 101 on the college level or AP U.S. History textbook, just like The American Pageant, which is another one that I've used quite frequently. Those books, and to a lesser extent, because there is some overlap here, I'm going to start dipping into some of the newer books that I'm going to be referencing heavily over the course of the next however many podcasts I do that have to do with the period 1815 to 1845. One of those books is the next chronologically book in the Oxford History of the United States series, What Hath God Wrought? That phrase, what hath God wrought, is what Samuel F.B. Morse, inventor of the telegraph, it's what he sent in the very first telegraph ever successfully produced on a wire that went from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. It's pretty appropriate for what the book covers, but it's a great book, and I'll be referencing it a little bit, stuff I learned from it a little bit in this episode. I will also be consistently using over the next few episodes, and a little bit for this one, a book that I've decided to make kind of the centerpiece of the episodes that I'm going to do upcoming, and that is The Market Revolution, Jacksonian America, 1815 to 1846, by Charles Sellers. I was just really inspired by what I read there, and I thought that it was one of the most insightful, one of the most interesting books I've ever read on the history of anything. So I thought that I should focus on it for the next few episodes I'm going to do, and that's what I'm here to do. But for this episode, I am mostly going to be talking about what I read in the last chapter of Gordon S. Wood's Empire of Liberty. And as always, I'm going to give you folks a question to think about as I go through the episode, because I think it helps everyone, certainly helps me, to better process all of this fairly complicated information. So here it goes. Here's the question for this episode. To what extent was there a revolution politically and socially in the United States from 1785 to 1815? And how did the changes in economy and government made manifest by this supposed revolution result in an America that looked very different in 1815 than it had in 1785? I'll say that one more time. To what extent was there a revolution politically and socially in the United States from 1785 to 1815, and how did the changes in economy and government made manifest by this supposed revolution result in an America that looked very different in 1815 than it had in 1785? So think about that as I go through this stuff. I think it'll help you to connect the dots maybe a little bit better. Okay? Without further ado, here we go. Let's start at the end of the War of 1812. But not where you think. Not in Ghent, not even in New Orleans. Start instead in the ordinary towns and mills of the northern United States. There are carding rooms by firelight, small mills that run along creeks, kitchen tables that double as workbenches. If you want to see what really changes after 1815, don't examine the treaties and speeches. Look at the common people. What those Americans are doing, and what most Americans now think counts as worthy work, by now I mean in 1815, shifts decisively. The United States emerges from the war still overwhelmingly rural and agricultural. But under the surface, it's relentlessly commercial. Farmers are also tanners. Tanners moonlight as shopkeepers. Shopkeepers speculate a little on the side. If Europe emphasizes tiny categories and classes and castes, frankly, merchant here, farmer there, aristocrat and monarch in charge, Americans blur these categories and classes. Albert Gallatin, the erstwhile Secretary of the Treasury for both Jefferson and Madison, observed that in the interior of the United States, away from the cities, a single individual often had to wear multiple hats at once. That becomes the norm, not the exception. The embargo, the war, the roller coaster Atlantic trade, all that forced Americans to supply themselves. Before 1808, the U.S. had around 15 cotton mills. Within 2 years, nearly 90 more appeared. By 1814, a contemporary like Tench Coxe could count hundreds of cotton mills across 15 states. So you see the explosion in industry in that very short period of time, 1808 to 1814. It's not a huge building, though, these factories. They are not huge buildings. They're not factories as you and I envision them right now in the present, or even as we would have envisioned them maybe 100 or 150 years ago. Instead of a big, huge building with workers constantly in motion, reaching over each other, bumping into one another, sweating and sewing and cutting and probably getting injured pretty frequently in this tight-knit space, it's a long wooden building on the river in a rural area using the water's power for its pretty modest machinery, and it's probably only employing a few dozen workers at the most. Factory production is also in individual households in the countryside. They are spinning and weaving in off hours, children helping, women's labor accounting for a huge share of the total output. In 1810, most textile production, on the order of 90% of it, still comes from homes, not mills. The picture is part Samuel Slater's Rhode Island system, as it was called because he built it out in guess where. It's part putting out network and part a nation of farm families that are producing goods for trade or sale after the sun goes down when they can't really work in the fields any longer. Zoom in on a typical town in the early republic, Mount Pleasant, Ohio, in 1815. It has only about 500 people, but it's bristling with trades. There are multiple hatters, blacksmiths, shoemakers, cabinet makers, wagon builders, tanneries, wool carding, and even a nail factory, plus a ring of mills within just a few miles. If you took a snapshot at that moment, you'd swear the United States was a constellation of small workshops, each one a little self-contained economy. Meanwhile, the cities are tiny. By 1820, there are 5 urban centers in all of the United States with over 25,000 people. New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, and New Orleans. That's it. And together, they hold only a tiny sliver of the population of the United States overall. 19 out of 20 Americans still live in what the census calls rural places. And yet, the feel of society is changing faster than the head count suggests that it is. Between 1800 and 1820, the workforce doesn't urbanize. It actually records a higher percentage of workers in the agricultural sector than in industry at the beginning of the period. So I'm saying that there are a greater percentage of Americans in agriculture in 1820 than there were in 1800, which is not generally how we would think of the evolution of economies like the United States in the 19th century. But that agricultural America that we're seeing is more market-minded, more enterprising, more self-conscious about money and improvement than it had been just a generation earlier. Here's the shift. Americans stop apologizing for pursuing profit. A lot of 18th century elites worried that chasing money would corrode Republican virtue. By 1815, the air is cleared. A new political generation, I'm talking about Henry Clay, John Calhoun, Daniel Webster, Langdon Cheves, etc., talks openly about manufacturers, canals, and the home market without flinching. Jefferson himself, who once imagined the nation as a bunch of independent yeoman farmers trading what little surplus they had abroad, writes after the war that circumstances have changed. If Europeans can choke off commerce, which they kind of did, also the United States contributed to it voluntarily, and in fact committed to it voluntarily. But if commerce can be choked off from Europe to the United States, then, as Jefferson points out, Americans must learn to make what they need. He, Jefferson, remains wary of English-style factory towns, but he concedes that the manufacturer and the farmer must now stand side by side. So what happens in the 1790s is something that a lot of the gentlemen, the genteel class, the Alexander Hamiltons, the George Washingtons, the John Adamses of the world, what they did not see coming was this massive push for democracy. What a lot of leaders did imagine was a more homogenous America in the 1790s by raising the quote-unquote lower orders or middling sort or whatever you would want to call average Americans up to enlightened politeness. By 1815, though, the opposite has kind of happened. Ordinary people are pulling gentlemen down into everyday life. What do I mean by that? Titles flatten. The man unloading barrels at the wharf can be, and often is, addressed as a gentleman or Mr. in public, when that was typically reserved for the social betters of working class people. A Federalist minister in Boston famously fumes that, quote, everything smells of the shop. Lawyers are mere lawyers. Doctors are mere doctors. Ministers are mere ministers. In other words, professions are becoming jobs, not perches from which to dabble in statesmanship. And what I mean by that is that there were many lawyers in the pre- and immediately post-revolutionary period who saw lawyering as just something they did to make ends meet and not as like a career or something that would define them. And the same was true of physicians or anybody that was from the upper classes, usually people descended from big landowners or merchants, people with money. They took on professional jobs, but not because they wanted those as a career necessarily. Some did, most didn't. And instead, what you had by the 1790s and early 1800s is more and more people from that upper class with money who became their jobs in much the same way that working class people had always been. So what that means is instead of having this elite gentry that guys like Hamilton in particular had envisioned as a ruling class that would direct society and the government on the behalf of everyone, in the best interests of everyone, everything becomes much more democratized. And there is a much greater level of similarity socially, politically, economically to the traditional upper classes and the working classes. The culture follows the money. Respectability, once the finishing polish of a small elite, becomes a mass aspiration, what one historian calls vernacular gentility. Middlebrow Americans buy etiquette manuals and abridgments of Chesterfield. They put pianos in parlors and tea sets on sideboards. They care about penmanship and elocution. They are not trying to pass as aristocrats. They're inventing a democratic version of gentility that fits a shopkeeper's budget and a mechanic's schedule. At the same time, a powerful myth of equality takes hold, and not only because of laws and ballots, it's psychological. Visitors to America from Europe notice that even farm towns brim with small manufacturers and traders, that householders are rarely destitute, and that deference is thin on the ground, meaning that there isn't this sort of innate behavior amongst the lower classes, the working classes, the middling sorts, whatever you want to call them, to give this automatic respect, deference to the elites. That's not a thing in America the way that it is in Europe. That is not to say that there isn't wealth inequality. There very much is in the United States in this period. And in fact, it's becoming more pronounced. There are smaller numbers of people that own more of the wealth in the country at this time than had been the case during the Revolution, during the colonial days. But the permitted distance between different groups of people, whatever their wealth, shrinks. A Connecticut traveler can talk about the absence of feudal remnants while admitting farm sizes range from tiny to thousands of acres. The point isn't that Americans are equal. It's that they increasingly behave as though no one has the right to look down their nose at anyone else. If you want an avatar for this middling ethos, it's got to be Benjamin Franklin. After 1794, editions of Franklin's autobiography proliferate, soon bundled with Poor Richard's Almanac and The Way to Wealth. Young men devour them. A farmer's son reads Franklin and heads to the city to teach, then keep a store. Another one arrives in New Haven with bread and cheese in his bundle and becomes a clockmaker with hundreds of employees. A Long Island boy quits the farm and eventually founds a major publishing house and serves as mayor of New York. What's new isn't upward mobility. It existed before. What is new is boasting about humble origins and treating money made in business as a badge of honor. Old guard Federalists kind of wince at this. But the middling public just shrugs and keeps pushing on. With that ethos, honor culture also begins to retreat. Dueling doesn't vanish, but after Burr kills Hamilton, its prestige definitely erodes. Especially when some servants kind of invoke the same code, it brings it down a level, and to the gentleman, quote unquote, who once engaged in the practice, it seems now vulgar and crude, does dueling. The North, in particular, trades elite honor for middle-class character, meaning sobriety, diligence, thrift. Temperance talk, once a classical virtue of self-command, reframes itself as a campaign against ordinary drunkenness. It's not Cicero anymore. It's a society of shopkeepers deciding that drunk employees are just bad for business and for moral standards of the community. Here's the intellectual pivot that makes the whole system make sense. Americans stopped measuring commerce only by ships and customs houses. Hezekiah Niles publishes this national weekly magazine, newspaper, whatever you'd want to call it, called Niles Weekly Register. And it, the Register, becomes a national metronome of practical politics and numbers for the whole country. And in this publication, Niles argues that a community's richest trade is internal, not with countries outside of its borders. The web of exchanges from township to township, farm to village, city to hinterland is the exchange that Niles says is the most important one, not the one between, say, the United States and Britain. In Niles's view, and it resonates with people, the foreign trade of the United States, even in peace, is a small fraction of the total traffic of goods and services. Before this, only folks who traded goods overseas were thought of as appropriately labeling themselves merchants. But Niles and others push the notion that the goal isn't autarky or complete independence of the United States from other countries, the way that the mercantilist model had preached. It's a recognition that the Republic is big enough, varied enough, and busy enough to be, as some say, a world within ourselves, which is incidentally the title of the chapter that I'm discussing here. That argument does two things at once. First, it elevates the status of inland traders and shopkeepers, who had long been looked at as mere handlers of goods, people who shifted around wealth instead of creating it. If commerce now includes the road between Lancaster and Philadelphia, or the canal between Albany and Buffalo, the storekeeper's role becomes respectable, even necessary. Second, it provides the political justification for internal improvements. Roads, bridges, ferries, canals, these aren't local pork projects the way that some have painted them. They're national infrastructure linking a continental market. A young John C. Calhoun can make a straight-faced case that appropriations for improvements bind the Republic together, as he put it. And he's not talking about poetry. He's describing how flour, cloth, iron, and people move within the country. One of the chapter's core emphases is the practical turn in learning. 18th century elites had cherished science as a gentleman's cosmopolitan pastime. Catalog the heavens, classify nature, elevate the mind. Post-1815 America doesn't sneer at that, but it asks a blunt question. What can it do? What does all this science and learning accomplish? Enter the age of useful knowledge. A new Baconian habit floods the culture. Facts, facts, facts. City stats, production counts, newspaper numbers, theory yields to enumeration. Let the reader infer. The democratization has side effects, blurred lines between science and quackery, credulity alongside skepticism, a public that trusts its senses and doubts expertise. Sound familiar? But the net effect is unmistakable. Learning is now a tool for prosperity, not a ladder to polite society. The practical upshot is a reevaluation of what kind of knowledge matters. The old learned societies, cosmopolitan, taxonomic, serene, had their place in the 18th century. They cataloged comets and shells and kept gentlemanly science respectable. But a new mood is spreading. If knowledge doesn't help with bread, butter, beer, textiles, engines, bridges, and roads, Americans are a lot less interested. That is not a rejection of science. It is a domestication of it. Chemistry should improve brewing, baking, soap making, tanning, and dyeing. Mechanics should cut labor and raise output. Medicine, in theory, should be clearer and more practical. When Harvard endows a chair in the useful arts, the professor, a guy named Jacob Bigelow, tells his audience the quiet part out loud. Europe has many learned men, he says. America needs many useful men. That sentence would probably have freaked out a lot of salon attendees in 1760, or even a lot of the intellectual elite of the United States in the post-revolutionary era. In 1816, that sentence earns nods from farmers, mechanics, and legislators who want results. You can hear the same tune in Jefferson's correspondence. Apply science to malting, distilling, baking, cheese making. John Adams says something very similar, by the way. Once you grant that premise, the practicality of learning, of knowledge, the hero gallery changes. Eli Whitney, who I've recently read was given a lot more credit for the cotton gin maybe than he should have gotten. I'll get into that in later episodes, but he still does deserve some credit for it, and certainly for interchangeable parts, which I'll get into later on. Robert Fulton, who very much deserves credit for the steamboat, which was a huge deal. Both of those guys, because of their contributions, become something of civic saints. Oliver Evans, a Delaware-born apprenticed wheelwright, automates flour milling, introduces bucket elevators and conveyors, and then builds a high-pressure steam engine at his Mars Works in Philadelphia. Thomas Blanchard, a Massachusetts mechanic who started with apple parers and tack counters, invents a turning lathe that can shape irregular wood forms, gun stocks for example, at scale. Most of these men don't start with fortunes or degrees. They start with a problem to solve and a tolerance for broken parts on the shop floor. This is also where the American taste for numbers kicks in. Dry, sometimes trivial, but democratically persuasive. Printers brag about how many sheets they can run in a day. A city report tallies gallons of lamp oil burned per year. The implied message is, judge us by outputs. The downside is that facts without interpretive guardrails can breed both confidence and credulity. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who is a big revolutionary leader in addition to being a physician, insists there's one basic disease, fever, and that bleeding and purging can cure nearly anything. Another learned man discovers an element, septin, to explain decay and disease. If every man can be his own lawyer or doctor, one college professor grumbles, then every man is also his own skeptic and his own mark, unfortunately. The medical conclusions of Benjamin Rush turned out to be quite disastrous for a lot of people. Meanwhile, politics quietly learns the same lesson the mills and shops learned. Ignore the middling sort at your peril. Nothing illustrates that more starkly than the 1816 congressional pay raise. Members convert a daily per diem into a flat salary that, when you do the math, about doubles their pay. One Maryland representative can't resist a flourish about how members used to, quote, live like gentlemen and enjoy a proper glass of wine. That's a sentence that lands like a wine bottle smashed against the wall. Newspapers across party lines roast Congress. Public meetings denounce the raise, effigies of politicians are burned, and in the next election, nearly 7 in 10 congressmen are not returned to office. A chastened Congress repeals the change and drops pay to a simpler per diem. Lesson delivered. Representatives are not umpires hovering above the public. They are agents who answer to it. If the Enlightenment preferred deliberation at a certain stoic distance, the new democracy prefers accountability, emotional and intimate. By 1815, Congress and the parties are full of 30-somethings, like the guys I mentioned earlier, Clay, Calhoun, Cheeves. These are men who don't wear powdered wigs, don't bow to old-school deference, and don't apologize for talking about money, roads, banks, and trade. And new professionals, like Martin Van Buren, notice something essential. If the people are the nation, enduring parties aren't corrupt factions. They're tools for organizing popular will. That is the beginning of the pivot toward the mass party politics that will take over in the 1820s and 30s and be firmly established by the 1840s. The political system snaps to attention around a middle-class electorate that believes it's the whole country. And increasingly, this electorate acts like it's the whole country. Put those pieces together, and the post-1815 United States starts to look less like a polite drawing room and more like a crowded workshop. It's noisy, improvisational, and profit-seeking. It's morally earnest in a practical way, and deeply suspicious of airs, putting on airs. That's the environment in which titles flatten, schooling spreads, newspapers multiply, and the word democracy, once an insult in elite mouths, becomes a point of pride. Short version. After 1815, the United States doesn't just have a middle class. The United States becomes a middle class. At street level, the early republic looks the same. Still rural, still mostly agricultural, but the feel has definitely changed. In the northern cities and the smaller towns, everyone's a farmer and something else. Weaver, distiller, glove maker, fill in the blank. The one rank myth emerges at this time. Not because wealth gaps vanish, again, they don't, but because status built on birth and display is outflanked by status built based on work. It's psychologically egalitarian, and that is enough to reorder the culture. If you want a sentence that captures the epitome of all of this, I'd put it like this. After 1815, Americans still farmed like the 18th century, but they thought and traded like the 19th century. The outward forms didn't change, but the operating system sure as hell did. So that's where we are. You've got a new middle class that has come to dominate things. Things are much more democratic and much more practical. It's a lot less highfalutin and intellectual and theoretical than it had been in the Revolutionary era or in the era that immediately followed. So that's where we're headed. It's our first step in the exploration of the post-War of 1812 period, and it's an interesting one, and I can't wait to share it all with you. Thanks very much for listening. As always, you can reach out to me at howthehelldiwegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can leave a voicemail or text me at area code 951-525-5536. Thanks very much for listening as always, and I will catch you all next time. Take care.